learn to read. When you might be able to tell I have a speech impediment because I have this well, I don't want to call it a handicap, but because I have that impediment, they got me motivated by giving me books about animals, such as frogs, to read and get into the academic world. So here's our animal, here's our wood frog. And when we think of frogs in general, we think of this kind of blobby amphibian, just this mushy blob with long legs that hops around and has this complex lifestyle. So let's focus on those two things first, the body of the animal and the life cycle of the animal. The life cycle has been drilled into our heads since we were in kindergarten. So we've got frogs, they come together, the male climbs on top, he deposits sperm into the water while the female deposits the eggs into the water. So we've got external fertilization, no eggshells here. And the female squirts out her eggs, which come out of the frog about the size of a golf ball. Once it hits the water, it expands, kind of like tapioca. So on the bottom of this image here, we have an older egg mass, and right behind the female's legs, we can see the new egg mass coming in. So we start off frog life as an egg in a mass of hundreds of eggs. Those hatch out into tadpoles. The tadpoles have these long tails. They don't have any legs. They've got these big beady eyes. They have gills. And those will then undergo metamorphosis, where they will grow their legs, generally the back legs first, then the front legs will appear, and they'll suck up that tail and become what's known as a froglet. And that is the cutest piece of jargon that you're going to hear today. Froglet is the scientific term for a newly metamorphed frog. So this froglet has a tail stub, but besides that, he's got everything he needs to be an adult frog. Lungs. But there's a lot going on here that we haven't learned about in middle school. So let's go back to the adult frog there on the left. Adult frogs are meat eaters, they're carnivores. They hop around the forest eating insects. If it moves, it's probably, and it's smaller than you, then it's food. If it moves and it's bigger than you, it's probably a predator. So it doesn't really take much to be a frog. Those are your two big thoughts. As a vegetarian, so they're eating mostly algae in the pool. They'll be chewing on dead leaves that have algae growing on them. They'll be eating bacteria and fungus. Every now and then they'll eat some plankton. Every now and then they'll eat a dead colleague. But for the most part, they're vegetarians. So if we look at the guts of these tadpoles, and they're kind of see-through, we can see these big spirals. So they have these massive intestines to be able to break down all of that woody material, all of that vegetation, and use that to grow. Once they start to metamorph and they gain their legs and are absorbing their tail, they stop eating. And then as a froglet, they're back to the adult part of the life cycle, where they are eating insects and little things that move around. So the digestive system here has this major overhaul going on during metamorphosis. It's a very stressful time to be a frog. Because we're going from a vegetarian to a carnivore, we need to redesign the entire digestive system. We need to take out that huge gut, similar to a cow gut or a horse gut, where they're really breaking down that vegetation. And we need to make it into something that's more like a cat gut, where it's a short intestine and it's much easier to digest protein. So we don't need to have as much space within the body, as much energy maintaining that digestive system. So since we're breaking down our digestive system and going from a horse digestive system to a cat digestive system, they need to just have this period in the middle where the digestive system is turned off. And that's the metamorphosis right there in the middle, where they're not eating. Instead, they still need to get energy somewhere, so they're literally digesting their tail to be able to have the energy to continue to function while this change is happening. And there's another thing going on here that's very important that we don't see, and that's the immune system. As a frog, you have a frog immune system. As a tadpole, you have a tadpole immune system. When you're a metamorph, you're both frog and tadpole at the same time, so we need to turn off the immune system. Otherwise, those tadpole immune system, because, you know, what's this cell doing here? It's a frog cell. I'm not a frog, I'm a tadpole. And at the same time, any um, any cells from the adult immune system are going to be going after the tadpole cells. So because the change is so dramatic, they actually have to turn off their immune system. This means that during metamorphosis, frogs are incredibly susceptible to disease. This is the time where we see mass die-offs when a disease goes through a population. I've had times, probably about a dozen times in the past 10 years, where I've walked out to a vernal pool or another wetland, and one day it's completely fine, tadpoles are swimming around, everything's good. And then 2 days later, I go and all the tadpoles are floating belly up, covered in fungus, starting to decay. And then within a couple of days, those bodies are gone, and all you see is a pool that has no tadpoles in it. And what's happened there is that as the tadpoles reached metamorphosis and turned off their immune system, ranavirus, a native and relatively common virus, has gone through and wiped them out during this period. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that population is not going to recover. It just means that that particular year, there's not going to be any juveniles produced to add to the population. So here we have the skeleton of an adult frog. So let's take away all the flesh and look at what a frog is based off of these bones here. If we look at the legs, we'll see that they're very elongated. Coming from the hips out, we've got the femur. And then where we would have a tibia and a fibula for our lower leg, the frog has a fused bone, fused long bone there. And then where we would have our tarsals, the main part of our foot there, they've only got the two bones together, and those are combinations of the fused tarsals. And then they've got really long toes sticking out. So everything about this hind leg is they can push off the ground for as long as possible. If you're a frog and your main defense is going to be getting away from the predator before it can pick you up, you want to be pretty quick at doing it. So if you're swimming in the water, you want to push a lot of water at once. And if you are hopping across the ground, you want to hop as far as you can, as fast as you can away from this predator. To hop on land, the longer that you are in contact with the ground, the longer you can be pushing. So long legs for the frogs means further jumps, means more force so that they can get away from these predators. Very similar to if you think of a rabbit, they've got long feet. If you think of a kangaroo, they've got long feet. Long feet are an adaptation for what's called saltatory locomotion for jumping. Now let's look up the body of this frog. We've got where its pelvis is, we have this fused series of bones that are in a shape like a U, and then we've got this piece going down the middle of them. That's the Euro style, which is the equivalent of our pelvis. And it works as a long hinge so that we can continue to extend that force. The bone in the middle is a series of fused vertebrae, so that we can have muscle attachment there. And it makes it pretty rigid. The spine above that is just a few vertebrae together, and then we've got the neck, very short neck, often fused, leading up to the skull. So we don't want a lot of movement within the dorsal of the frog. We want that to be solid and fused together, because as the frog's jumping, we don't want a lot of bending and torque going in and damaging those tissues. The front of the frog, the arms there, they're entirely designed for landing. So they're not pushing up with those front legs. They're just landing on them, being cushioned by them. They have, the shoulder blades are not attached to the rib cage or the spine, so that they're more flexible and can cushion that landing. The projections sticking out along the spine there are just parts of the vertebrae. They're not actually ribs. So frogs and salamanders tend not to have rib cages because they're not trying to protect the organs by making a shell around them or encasing them. They're just trying to get away from the predator before it gets to that point. Not having those bones there makes them a little bit lighter so that they're able to jump further. And then one last thing, looking at the head there, we can see that it's got huge places for the eyes. they'll actually move their eyes when they're eating. They can use their eyes to help push food down their throat. They've got muscles attached from their eyeballs to the skull that when they shrink, the eyes come in. And that's also good for swimming underwater. If you're going to go underneath a branch, you might bump into it, so you can pull your eyeballs in and swim under the water and be a little bit more streamlined. You don't want to get your eyes caught on things that could be messy. And then we've got this tiny little brain case in between those orbits. The brain of a frog is kind of looks like a piece of spaghetti. The more complex your brain is, the more surface area to volume, the more ripples and ridges and dents you have in your brain, the more space you have for cognition and for higher functions. So for a frog with its spaghetti brain, there's not a lot of thoughts going on there. Most of what the frog does is literally, if it moves and it's smaller than me, I'm gonna eat it. And if it's bigger than me, I'm gonna assume it's a predator. Besides that, it's habitat selection, it's looking for mates, it's listening for competitors. So relatively simple in terms of brains. Now here we've got the tadpole. And I can't show you a slide of the tadpole skeleton because they don't have them. Tadpoles don't have any bones in them. They have some cartilage in the later stages. But for the most part, it's just a ball of tissue swimming around. So we've got a very different design to this animal. We've got a boat-shaped head, so a submarine-shaped head slash body that are attached as one, so relatively streamlined with a big muscular tail sticking out. If we were to take the skin off of this tadpole and look at that tail, it would look just like the side of a fish. Same shape for all of the muscles, and the design there is really to have a big, strong tail to push this thing through the water. Sticking up along the top of this animal, we can see that it's got a little bump. That's a spiracle. The tadpole is going to be sucking water in through its mouth, pushing it over its gills, and then it scoots the water, squirts the water out through that little spiracle, which allows it to, it can be used for propulsion, but mostly it's just used for breathing. And besides that, we've got eyes and guts, and there's not much to the tadpole. It's a eating machine. They eat, they poop, they hide, they bask in the sun. They're kind of like cows. They spend the whole day grazing, just trying to metamorph and build up their bodies as quickly as they can. Okay. So that's frogs in general. In Maine, we have a relatively low diversity of animals because it's cold here and amphibians don't really like cold. But we are fortunate enough to have 9 different species of frogs. So I'm going to work through these pretty quickly. If you have a frog and you pick it up and it's not slimy and it's got lots of bumps on it and stubby little legs, you're holding an American toad. We only have 1 species of toad in Maine. So if you have a Maine toad, it's American toad, Anaranxus americanus. This genus is relatively new. Until a few years ago, we considered them to be bufo. Some people still consider them to be bufo. I kind of just like lean back and go for what the rest of the room is saying. To me, it's an American toad. I don't really need to know exactly what the genus is. It's this population. It might need to be conserved. It might be abundant, and I just work on the population level and for conservation purposes. Next, we have the gray tree frog, Hyla versicolor. Tree frogs get to be about 2 to 4 inches. They are also bumpy, but not as bumpy as the toads are, and they are slimy. They have these big suction cups along the ends of their fingers, which kind of make their fingers look like alien fingers. If you pick one up and you look at the inside of its legs, it's got a bright yellow coloration that's used to startle predators. And they are a very nocturnal frog that climbs up in trees, just like the name suggests. They're generally about 20 to 30 feet up in the trees. And if you have a pipe sticking out of your house, maybe a water spout or a awning that's got a pipe along it, it might serve as a home to one of these guys. Tree frogs love tubes. So if you can put tubes up in trees, PVC pipes, and they'll act as little birdhouses, and you can go and check out your frog population that way. Spring peepers are the tiniest frog that we have in Maine, generally about the size of my pinky nail, though they can get up to about 2 inches. And they are incredibly loud. This is one of the first frog to call in the spring. They generally will breed in places where there's permanent water, but they'll also use seasonal wetlands that have water that dry up very late in the season. This little guy is a male, and he's been calling so much that he's stretched out his vocal sac. So that dangling thing underneath his throat there is his uninflated vocal balloon that he uses to call females. Now, these guys are so loud that I actually know a biologist who has blown out his eardrums enough times on spring peepers that he can no longer hear them. He'll be in a swamp with a bunch of wetland students, and they'll be talking about, oh, those peepers are so loud, and he just can't hear them. He's like, you mean wood frogs? No, they mean peepers. Then we've got our 3 green ranids for Maine, and get rid of that. Okay. So the bullfrog, the green frog, and the mink frog are all relatively large green frogs that have, they need permanent water. So we'll find them in rivers, we'll find them in streams, we'll find them in roadside ditches if they keep water long enough. They're very similar frogs in their habitat requirements and in their life history. So the bullfrog here on the left, if we look at its back, it's got some bumps, but it's relatively smooth in terms of it doesn't have ridges. Look at the green frog here in the middle, and we've got a ridge that goes from its eyeball back along its side to its hind legs. That's its dorsolateral ridge. And that is a diagnostic characteristic. If we have a frog in hand and we know it's either a bullfrog or a green frog, we look for that ridge. Now, bullfrogs do get bigger. They can be all the way up to 8 inches, whereas a green frog maxes out at about, we'll say 5. 4 inches is big for a green frog. This one here is juvenile, so he's probably about 1 inch long. So differences in size, but you go off of that ridge when you're trying to make your positive ID. The mink frogs on the right are a little bit different. They are very similar to bullfrogs. So to tell them apart, you can look at the webbing on the hind feet. There's a couple of very nuanced differences. You can smell them. The name mink frog comes from a musk that they produce that smells like a mink's musk, so they are kind of a stinky frog. Though most times that you pick them up, they won't actually produce that musk on you. So the best way to know is to listen for them calling. A bullfrog sounds like a bull, surprise there. The green frog sounds like a twanging rubber band or a banjo, so sometimes they're called banjo frogs. Mink frogs sound like a nail being nailed into a piece of wood. The range can also give you a little bit of a clue about which of these 3 species you have in hand, because mink frogs are the most northern frog in terms of the limit of their southern range. So while wood frogs actually get further north than mink frogs do, wood frogs also get further south. So in terms of the southern range extent, mink frogs are the northernest frog. And that's what septentrionalis in those species name means. Rana means frog, septentrionalis means the northernmost. As an aside, clamitans means noisy. Versicolor means changing color, because when they're asleep, they'll turn white. When they are frustrated, they will turn dark, and usually they're kind of gray. And crucifer is referring to the X on the back of the spring peeper's back. Now we've got our spotted frogs in the ranid family, the true frog family. We've got the piccolo frog, and then we've got the leopard frog. Piccolo frogs tend to have boxes, whereas leopard frogs tend to have circles for those spots. So if we look at this piccolo frog on the left here, and we look at the spots that are right along its back, we can see that they kind of make squares with right angles, some of them, not all of them. We also only have 2 rows of spots going down this frog's back. If we look at the leopard frog here, sometimes we'll have 3 rows of spots, and we don't have anything that looks squarish. They all look much more like circles. They've got a light outline to them. Now, if you can catch the frogs, that's the best way to tell the 2 of these apart, because a piccolo frog on the inside of its legs is going to have a bright orange color, just like the gray tree frog does. So if you can get them in hand, take a picture of the inside of their thighs, that's the best way to identify these animals. And then our last frog is the wood frog. So we'll talk a lot about them. One more thing I want to mention, though, is so we've got a toad, a tree frog, and a peeper. Well, peepers kind of are tree frogs, depending upon how close down in the taxonomy you look. And then everyone else, the other 6 frogs, are all in the genus Rana. This is another genus that has recently switched names. So you might see them referred to as Lithobates. Now, Rana is a female genus, and then Lithobates is a male term. So when we use Lithobates, the species name will change too. So Lithobates sylvatica sylvaticus rather than Rana sylvatica. So you might see them referred to as different names. There's a lot of debate going on right now about whether they should have their own genus or if they should be lumped together in the same genus as the European frogs, which were named much earlier than them. I'm personally a fan of Rana. It means frog. Lithobates means sits on rocks, and wood frogs just don't really do that very much. So I like Rana. So here's our character for the rest of the talk. Here's our wood frog. Now, to know that you have a wood frog, there's a couple different characteristics that you can look at. First is that black mask. Wood frogs have a dark mask. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's pink, sometimes it's brown, going from their nose to their eyes to the corner of their jaw. Underneath that, we've got a white lip. So those two characteristics, the mask and the white lip, are the big diagnostic characteristics to let you know that you've got a wood frog. They tend to be a relatively smooth frog. They've got a dorsolateral ridge. The hind legs usually have some nice stripes going on them, and this helps them blend into the forest floor. So I like to joke that herpetologists, the biologists that study reptiles and amphibians, we're not very creative when we name things. So this is the wood frog, the frog that lives in the woods. Its species name, Sylvaticus, literally means of the forest. So we've got the bullfrog, it's just a frog that sounds like the bull. We've got the mink frog that smells like a mink. We've got a spotted turtle, surprise, it has spots. We have a spotted salamander and a blue spotted salamander. So not a lot of creativity in naming things, but the names do tend to give you a little hint about how to ID the animals. Okay. So it's not the appearance that makes wood frogs so special. It's actually where they live, the habitat, and what the habitat does to their behavior that makes them a special amphibian. So here we have a vernal pool. Vernal pools are wetlands that have no permanent inlets or outlets and that dry up. So because of those characteristics, we can't have fish surviving indefinitely in a vernal pool. If we introduce some bait fish into a vernal pool, when the pool dries up or when the pool dries down and there's limited oxygen in there, the fish population is going to die off. Vernal pools tend to be small, about the size of a classroom. Some of them are completely tiny, maybe about the size of a large bathroom. And some of them can be multiple acres. But for the most part, we've got a small wetland that dries up in the middle of the summer and then fills back up towards the winter so that fish can't live in them. Without fish, and fish are a huge predator of amphibians, a very important predator of amphibians, we have certain species that have adapted to breed only in vernal pools. So if we lose the vernal pools, we lose these species. These include the blue spotted salamander, the spotted salamander, the unisexual salamander, and the wood frog in Maine. If we go to other states, it can include even more species. We also have an invertebrate, the fairy shrimp, will only live in vernal pools. They need the pool to dry up and to freeze in order for their eggs to hatch. So a very specialized little shrimp. Looks like a giant sea monkey, giant brine shrimp. So here's our vernal pool in April when it has plenty of water in it. This might be 3 feet deep. They can be up to 10 feet deep. I've had plenty of vernal pools that have flooded my chest waders. Now we've got that same vernal pool in July when we're down to a tiny little puddle. All of the darker leaves here and the blackest tinted leaves, those tell us that this area was flooded. So dried up vernal pool. And then come the fall rains, this will start filling back up. The water table might rise and fill it up with groundwater as well. And around winter, it'll freeze, it'll have snow on top of it, and it just looks like a little clearing in the forest. This vernal pool, you might have noticed, has some black fence around it. That's a large amphibian trap. We've got buckets buried every 5 meters along the edge of the fence so that when the animals hit the fence, they will follow along, fall into one of the buckets, and we'll be able to measure it, release it, take pictures, take DNA samples, whatever it is that our study requires. In the winter, we knock down the fence and fill in the buckets because we don't want mammals and any other animals to get stuck in those buckets when it's so cold out. So even though that this pool is covered in snow and covered in ice, it's still got some life going on within it. It's like a lake where only the very top will freeze. Most vernal pools do not freeze solid. They'll have maybe 6 inches, 8 inches of ice on them, and you can drill a hole into them, look down, and you will see insects and crustaceans and little zooplankton swimming around down there, just doing what they do all winter long. Plenty of light comes through that ice, just like when you're ice fishing and you can see underneath. So the vernal pool life continues through the winter. Now, wood frogs, since they're specializing in vernal pools and they don't breed anywhere else, have to deal with the pool drying. The pool is really a time crunch. So within the span from April to July, the wood frog has to go through its entire reproductive process. They have to get to the pool, they have to lay their eggs, the eggs have to metamorph into froglets, and all of that has to happen before the pool dries up, or we get a situation like this. Here we've got a man standing in the middle of a dry vernal pool, and if you look between him and the middle of the picture, you can see a dark smudge. That is thousands of little tiny tadpoles that have dried up and turned into tadpole jelly. So this pool is not going to have any froglets coming out this year. They're all in the pool and they've all died, but there's still an important, we're going to have bears coming and eating them. There's going to be plenty of insects that go. So they're still contributing to the ecosystem. And that means that it's important not to necessarily move eggs when we look at a pool and we're like, oh, this is going to dry up too soon. We don't want to move all of the eggs out of the way, because yes, those eggs might not make it, but they might be feeding something else important, like different songbirds in the area. Also, you don't want to move the eggs because of those diseases I was talking about earlier. We don't want to be spreading coronavirus and spreading Kitcher disease and causing population crashes and for the year, causing the reproductive efforts to fail. Okay. So in order to deal with this time crunch, big frogs have a strategy that they share in common with the spotted salamanders and the blue spotted salamanders in Maine called Big Night. When breeding occurs, these animals want to all be moving at once. It's a mass migration that we call Big Night. So here on the left, we've got a vernal pool, and it's still got a lot of ice on it. It's just the edges of the vernal pool are open. If we go further south towards Maryland, the entire pool will be open by the time Big Night occurs, but up here in Maine, well, we like it cold. For the frogs to get there and to start to reproduce, they have some barriers in the way that we can use to help look for them. So roads. During Big Night, if you go out and watch animals crossing the road, or you go to your local vernal pool, you will see dozens or hundreds of wood frogs, depending upon how big your population is going to occur. All you have to do is step outside at night and smell the air. It's the first warm rain each spring. So when you step out of your apartment for the first time and the air kind of smells like mud, that's the microbes in the soil waking up from the nice warm rain. You start walking around and you'll see earthworms on your lawn that have come up and they're starting to drown in puddles. That's the ground being thawed, so the earthworms are trying to escape the moisture that's going into the ground. Those are two good signs that it's warm enough for the amphibians to migrate and get out of the ground and get to the vernal pools too. So first warm rain, first time it's above 40 degrees and raining in the spring, all of the wood frogs will wake up and they make this mass migration all on the same night and move down to the vernal pool where there will be tons of frogs calling. It's a great time to take kids out to look for vernal pools when these frogs are all going nuts. I particularly like to go the day after, so that I'm not getting wet from the rain. If I go in the middle of the day, if it's nice and sunny and warm, the frogs will be calling. Better yet, wait until about 9 o'clock at night when the animals have had a little bit of time to wake up, because they're mostly nocturnal. Go to the vernal pool when it's the night after Big Night, when it's not raining. Take your flashlight. You can skim along the surface and look for the wood frogs, and you can use your light to scan along the bottom and look for the salamanders. So hold your light there and you can watch the salamanders. They're going to dive underneath the leaves because they don't like the light. So then you turn your light off, count to 60. They'll be back up. You can shine your light on them again, take lots of pictures, and enjoy watching this spectacle of nature that happens in all forest. Okay. So once the wood frogs lay their eggs, the adults don't want to stay at the vernal pool. Vernal pools are just a nursery to the wood frog. The wood frog wants to spend most of its summer in a forested wetland. So this might be an area that has a stream going through it. It might be an area that has a series of vernal pools in it. It might be an area where the ground is just moist. So if you walk into the woods and you sit down and when you stand up, your butt's wet, that's a forested wetland. So that is the perfect summer habitat for the wood frogs, because this is not a species that likes to stay near permanent water. They want to go into the woods, like their name implies, hop around, eat bugs, and in order to stay moist, because they don't have, their skin doesn't hold water in very well, so they dry out very quickly. So in order to stay moist, they have to find these kind of wet places and just hang out around them. So they won't actually be in the stream. They might be like 4 feet away from the stream, underneath leaf litter or up along a rock, where they're going to maintain that moisture. Now, that's not a good place to spend the winter, because if you are overwintering in a place that's wet, then the moisture as it freezes around you can damage your skin. So wood frogs migrate a second time to the wintering habitat, which is going to be dry forest. And they will overwinter right underneath the leaves in Maine's western mountains. They'll dig down in the soil a few inches, up to 6 inches. And once they're there, they will freeze solid. So wood frogs are very special in that their entire body can freeze solid. They turn into what feels kind of like a frozen hamburger. As the cold temperature drops and their toes start to freeze, a chemical chain reaction occurs within the body of the wood frog, where all of their water leaves the cells, goes into the space between the cells or into the bloodstream, where once it freezes and expands, it's not going to cause damage to the cells. So the wood frog literally just freezes solid. When the thaw comes, and it'll go back to being a frog. This has been studied a lot in the laboratory, where they'll just put the frogs in a container and put them into a special freezer and take the measurements, take them out of this freezer, watch them come back to life, take the measurements. And then there's been just a few studies that have looked at frogs hibernating in the wild. Luke Scroff's work recently looked at the hibernating frogs in western Maine. And then the picture that I have here of the forest is my colleague Tom Hastings measuring snow depth next to a cage, and within that cage there is a hibernating wood frog. He waited till the frog went into hibernation, built this enclosure around it so that he could find the frog when it came out in the spring, and then just left it alone, but every week went out and measured how deep the snow was. And then he's got some hydrocones in there to look at humidity and temperature. So here's the actual cycle, annual cycle of migration for the wood frog. So a very complex life history for this animal. So they're hibernating on the bottom right in that upland forest, and then they migrate to the vernal pool on big night. They'll spend, the females are in and out of the vernal pool. They lay their eggs and they're done. The males will stick around waiting for other females for a few weeks, and then they migrate into the upland forest, the forested wetland rather, where they'll spend the summer. And then come November, they'll migrate back up to the upland forest. So on the season. Now, there's 2 different ways that we use that life cycle, use what we know about wood frogs to try to protect their populations. Here in the middle of this circle, we've got a dark polygon, and that is our vernal pool. So that's the nursery for these animals. The traditional way of protecting an amphibian is this yellow circle going around. That is just a buffer, 250 feet for the state of Maine. And within that circle, there's a certain amount of habitat that can be developed. So for this farmer, if he wanted to sell his land to a developer so that he could then take that money and put his kid through college, he would only be able to develop 25% of that circle. Now, the half of that circle is not frog habitat. So 50% of the circle, that's kind of a losing situation for the farmer. On the other hand, that circle doesn't include, in this particular case, the summer habitat of the frogs. So if we develop everything on the outside of that circle, it's then a losing situation for the frogs themselves. So in this particular case, we've got a lose-lose for the farmer and for the frog. Now, this other shape here, this yellow oblong shape, includes the breeding habitat, the summer wetland habitat, and a corridor of hibernation habitat for the frog. So we call that sometimes a directional buffer or a directional life zone, and that is a more specific case-by-case way of conserving the frogs. And in this case, that's more of a win-win. The farmer can develop more of the area, he can get more money for his land, and the frog can complete its entire life cycle. So my research looks at that a little bit further. So what happens when your landscape is already partly developed, when it looks like this? We've got our blue circle towards the bottom of this image representing our breeding habitat. Then we've got this neighborhood where it's relatively dry. And on the top of your screen, we've got a forest, and that forest is a very wet forest. So that's good summer habitat for the frogs. So how do they survive in an area like this? A lot of research has been done on the more natural areas for wood frogs. So I've been talking about the mountains. Tracy Rittenhouse did a lot of work out in the, I want to say, the Midwest, looking at where frogs go with using radio telemetry to see what kind of habitat they needed. So we know a lot about what frogs do in nature, but we don't really know much about what frogs do when they're in an urban area. So all research questions, well, what do the migration patterns of these animals look like when we've got houses and parks and parking lots in the way? What kind of habitat are they using? Are they selecting just the more natural area, or are they using people's lawns? And then we can take those and we can try to come up with ideas about how to make populations persist. So if somebody's going to develop around a vernal pool, what little things can they do, or big things, can they do to try to make sure that that frog population stays there for future generations? So we use radio telemetry for this study. On the right here, we've got a frog who's wearing a belt with a radio transmitter attached to it. The transmitter works like a little radio tower. It produces a radio frequency that we can pick up using a radio receiver. It's got a watch battery there, and then we've got the number on top of it and the microchip and a long antenna sticking out. This is a 0.3 gram transmitter. It weighs about the third of a weight of a penny, and we use bead cord like you would make a necklace out of for the belt to put around the animal. So we don't have to hurt the frog to be able to find out where he's going. We put this tiny little transmitter on, and then we follow it around with our antenna and our receiver. When we point the antenna in the direction that the frog is, it beeps louder so that we know which way to go, and as we walk towards the frog, the beep becomes louder again. Now we can adjust our receivers, make it more sensitive, and we can get within 1 foot of the frog. We can say the frog is somewhere in this 1 foot area, even if the frog is underground and we don't see it. If we do see the frog from a distance, generally we'll just mark the area and leave, because we don't want to disturb the animals every time that we go out and look for them. So not only do we need to know where the animal is, we need to know what the habitat looks like. So what environmental characteristics are in the area. So when we find the frog, or when we're looking at areas to compare the frog to, we take environmental data. So things like what kind of vegetation is in the area. Is it a lot of grass? Is it a lot of shrubs, a lot of trees? Is it a garden? The soil temperature, how much lawn is within the area the frog is in, how dense is the tree canopy cover above it, so that we can compare the sites where the frog uses to the sites where the frog doesn't use. Availability versus use is going to be our habitat selection. And for this study, we looked at how they were moving at both a coarse scale, where we looked at the locations once per day, and we looked at a fine scale, where we went out multiple times a night, really once an hour for each frog, in order to draw more of a dotted line and get a better idea of how the frogs were moving through the area. So that was the nocturnal fine scale study. And we did this at 3 different sites in the Bangor area. This is the Penobscot River running down the middle of your screen. We've got a neighborhood vernal pool in the northern part of Bangor. We have a park, Hayden Park with Sawyer Arena in it on the left southern side. And then there's a nursing home over in Brewer where we were examining the population and their movements as well. So 3 different study sites so that we've got multiple conditions, and that allows us to get a better picture. So it's not just, okay, in this one neighborhood, the frogs are behaving like this. It's more in general if we've got the multiple sites. So here's our nursing home vernal pool. This big area is pointing at the pool itself. The nursing home is located to the right of that. Beyond that, we've got a retirement home. And then we've got this beautiful stretch of forest where we expected the frogs were going to go over the summer. On the other side of the vernal pool, we've got a relatively quiet road, and then we've got a strip mall of crowded area with lots of lawns and development and relatively busy roads. So we thought the animals here were all going to head towards the right of your screen into this beautiful forest. We were able to catch 4 different frogs at this vernal pool, and none of them went that way. They hung out in this scrubby little remnant patch of forest, and that was it. So one of them spent most of the time near the vernal pool and then went up on top of a ridge. 2 of them, the yellow one and the blue one, headed towards this apartment complex, and there's a little ditch going around the edge of the lawn. They stayed near that ditch. They stayed within about 5 feet of that ditch for most of the season. And then we had our green guy here who went down into a briar patch located in someone's backyard. So these frogs aren't making the big migrations that we see in the natural populations. The life history has been truncated to just what's left at this area. Here's the park population. So we've got the yellow line pointing at the breeding wetland, and this is a park that's completely surrounded by development. This area has been developed for years and years and years. That is 95 along the left of your screen. And this is pretty much downtown Bangor with a population of frogs surviving in it. Here we've got 1 year's worth of frogs. This is 5 years from 2016. None of them left the breeding pool, and we thought that was strange, but we had a lot of mortality due to house cats in the area, and then a few mortalities that we're not sure what happened, and one transmitter that died prematurely. The battery just gave out. So we went out a second year, and we got a lot more frogs this time. And again, most of them stayed within the breeding wetland. Some of them migrated a little bit east and stayed within the wetland. And then we had one frog who actually did venture out of the wetland. He got about 100 meters from the edge of the swamp and then was eaten by a flock of grackles. So homophilic species that love people, kind of add to the mortality of these animals as well as the house cats do. And then our final site in the neighborhood here, we've got a cattail vernal pool at the end of that arrow. We've got that nice forested wetland on the other side on the northern part of this subdivision. And we tracked 10 frogs here in 2016. And most of them went north to that beautiful forested wetland. And then we had a couple that didn't quite make it. We had one, the yellow one, he went south, spent some time in a flooded area of a hayfield, and then moved into a shrubby area. The green one and the darker orange one were both mortalities. One was hit by a lawnmower, and another one was killed by a house cat. So here's me throwing some data at you. We've got our 3 different sites. N is the number of frogs. We've got the maximum days that we were tracking each frog, the median distance the frogs moved, and the maximum distance that they were from the wetland, with a 95% distance. So if you wanted to protect 95% of the population, how far would you have to protect? And we can see that these distances really vary. In fact, they're statistically significant. So we've got 2 sites where migration is heavily truncated, and then 1 site where migration is still occurring pretty well, but it's going through a neighborhood. So for our find scale, we wanted to know how they were getting through the neighborhood, and these are the animals that we tracked at night. So we put a little piece of reflective tape on the antenna of their transmitter, wore our raincoats and our snow pants, and went out every night and followed these animals through a suburban neighborhood where all of the neighbors got to know us pretty well because we had to knock on every door and ask for permission. Hey, if a frog goes in your lawn at 3 o'clock in the morning, do you mind if me and my cronies come out with flashlights and watch it? We'll probably be wearing black and you won't be able to see us. So we had to win the hearts of the neighborhood to be able to do this study, but You know, it worked. They liked us, and they threw us an ice cream party at the end. So here's what we found. We had um, a lot of frogs that moved north into the wetland as we expected, but it took them longer to get there than we thought that it would. It wasn't just one night for most of the animals, though some animals didn't make it in one night. A lot of them had to stop and spend time in a stopover area. So you'll see that a lot of these dots are underneath bushes. That's where the frogs were hanging out for maybe a couple of weeks before they were able to migrate again. And what they were waiting for is rain. They only moved when it was a downpour and relatively warm. You can see a red line that's relatively short. That frog reached a swimming pool where there were other frogs calling, and we tried to fish him out and did not find him. So swimming pool are another source of mortality for these animals. There's a light green line that only has 2 dots in it. Oh, each dot here is where we actually found a frog, and then the lines connecting them are just hypothetical paths. That frog, the light green frog, went into a garden and hung out underneath a rhubarb plant for a couple of days, and then his belt slipped off, and we don't know where he went. Light green frog traveled through the neighborhood and found a different wetland. The orange frog we didn't find actually at the pool. We found her when we were walking back and forth to the car from the pool, and we followed her as she bounced around house to house. And her and the light blue frog both spent a lot of time just hanging out in the grass. The light blue frog, he was in the grass for a couple of weeks, and that landowner was getting impatient. He wanted to mow the lawn, and eventually we told him, okay, just go ahead. If you killed the frog, it's it's data, it's your lawn, go ahead. And the frog survived being mowed because he was so far in the grass that he did not reach the blade. Let's see. So yeah, so the takeaways here that we see is that they don't really like hanging out in the lawns, but they are capable of doing it. But mostly if they need to stop moving, those bushes and rhubarb plants and brush piles are really important for these animals. So if you want to help frogs move through your neighborhood, all you have to do is plant a garden and put a bush out. And that's going to be really important for those frogs to survive during dry spells in their migration. Okay, so some conclusions from the study. First, that they're looking for forests rather than lawns. So the animals aren't going out to the middle of the park. They're not spending the summer in the middle of people's lawns. They're going through lawns, but they're trying to find forest. We've got varying migration distances. So some areas, the frogs just don't migrate. They stay in the vernal pool because there's no other forested wetland for them. And that they can cross lawns, but if they get stopped by either morning coming or by the rain letting up, having that diurnal reference in the form of a shrub can really help them. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now. So the biggest threats to frogs in general that I want to draw your attention to are habitat loss and degradation. Like a lot of other species, once we lose the habitat, you can't have the frogs. So without vernal pools, we don't have wood frogs. Climate change is going to be particularly important for wood frogs because as the climate warms and we get more cold spells and warm spells and less snow cover, the frogs are going to go through more freeze-thaw cycles. And there's only so many times you can freeze solid and thaw again before there's damage to your systems. Spread of disease, rhinovirus and chytrid virus, pollution in terms particularly of lawn chemicals and agricultural chemicals are a big deal to the frogs because they're just going to suck these chemicals right in through their skin. Overexploitation, this can include roadkill, but usually it means harvesting animals. So if we harvest too many frogs, and bullfrogs and pig frogs are big on this, overexploitation can cause population declines. And then finally, invasive species, both in the forms of invasive plants coming in and changing the habitat, and in competitive frogs coming in can cause declines of frog populations. So what can you do to help? First off, educate your peers. The more people know about amphibians, the more that they're going to care about them. And the more they care about them, the more likely they are to help in their conservation. If you want to avoid lawn chemicals yourself, pesticides do really bad things to frogs when they're trying to migrate through or if they run off into their breeding sites. Leave some shelter trees if you are into forestry. Those shelter trees or just shrubs and bushes in your neighborhood are going to help with those animals during migration and help them stay moist. Cats kill a lot of frogs during migration, so keep your kitties inside. support environmental organizations that are, particularly those that are trying to conserve habitat. And the most important thing you can do to help frogs is get out there and vote, so that we have people who understand the need for wildlife and for the environment for humans, because we're not just out there trying to keep pesticides out of vernal pools to help frogs. We want our children to not have to deal with these chemicals as well. A couple of resources for you. There's a really good marine amphibian reptile book out. This is available wherever books are sold and on Amazon by Mac Hunter, Ram Calhoun, and Malcolm McCullough. Some wonderful illustrations and a CD so you can learn the calls. Our webpage, the Of Pools and People webpage, is vernalpools.me. This has information, a lot of videos about how to identify different egg masses and find animals. We also are starting a outreach part of it. So there's a comic strip following the life cycle of salamanders on there, and a brand new coloring book that you can print out and hand out to children. Also, Lang Elliott has a fabulous web page so that you can learn the calls of the frogs and toads, so that you can identify what's calling from your backyard. Okay, and with that, I'll leave the names up, and we only have a few minutes left, so I think it's time for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. That was fascinating, very passionate, and great work. This is going to be a fabulous resource to educate others that we'll put on our website. So a few questions, and if people need to get off as we're going through this, don't feel obligated to stay on because of the time, but this is really wonderful information. So one of the questions that we got from Beth Besson is she says, thank you for this wonderful and informative presentation, Chris. Can you speak a bit about how changing climate conditions would alter these life cycle patterns of Maine's amphibian species? I know you briefly mentioned it, but is there anything else that you would like to provide?
Yes. So with amphibians being so susceptible to drying out because their skin is so permeable, climate change can do a real wallop on these animals, particularly compared to mammals and to reptiles, which are better at conserving water. So first off, the drier it is, the drier those forested wetlands are going to be, and the less quality habitat that they're going to be for these amphibians. Also, if we look at the breeding cycle for frogs in general, where they need those wetlands to breed in for their tadpole stage, if the climate changes, it's going to affect those wetlands. So let's take a scenario where where we don't have as much snow cover because it's warmer and we're getting more rain, or the snow is thawing earlier. Now we don't have as much runoff in the springtime to fill up those vernal pools all at once. So if we have a vernal pool that's not connected to groundwater, that pool might not have water in it anymore, and that population might just die out. If we do have groundwater, the groundwater might surge and then recede too early for these animals. So if we're not replenishing the groundwater, we might have a shorter hydro period for the vernal pool. Also, if we don't have such a good big night is very dependent on having cold rains and then a warm rain to wake everything up and to coordinate everyone. If we have a bunch of little trickle nights instead of big nights, the animals are going to be more spread out when they get there. They might not have as good success at finding a mate. And then if the pool does dry up sooner, all of the tadpoles are going to die. So on top of the hibernation, we've got every stage of the life cycle for these amphibians. It really depends on the climate, and it's very and they are specific to the local area. So if we take a frog from Ohio and bring it up to Maine, it's not going to be adapted to our climate. It's going to be adapted to Ohio's climate, and it's not going to, like, the Maine frogs need Maine's climate, and as the climate change, we might see their populations decline. One other thing is disease is very closely linked to climate change. You might have heard of the mass die-offs in Central America and Australia due to chytrid virus. One of the primary causes of those mass die-offs was climate change. So warmer areas means the disease has a higher metabolism and can infect more animals. So yeah, climate change is bad news for frogs.
Great answer. That's really, really interesting. So David Oakes says, thank you, love your enthusiasm and the work that you are doing. What is the overall health of the wood frog population in Maine and beyond?
In Maine, the wood frogs are currently doing fairly well. If we go further south towards the southern limits of the range, we are seeing large declines of them. There are areas, I mentioned Ohio, I'll mention Ohio again. There are areas in Ohio where there used to be lots of, relatively common wood frogs, large populations, where they're entirely gone. And we think that that's a climate change thing. It's also a habitat loss and a chemical thing. So wood frogs in general, there are areas where they're doing okay and there are areas where they're not doing okay. Generally, the less people you have, the healthier population of wood frogs you have. One more thing that contributes to that is connectivity of vernal pools. So if we have a vernal pool that dries up too early most years, then has a wet season, we're going to get a bumper crop of wood frogs coming out of that, of froglets coming out of that pool. If we've got another pool nearby that every year has a good number of froglets coming out, then those populations are going to have some crossover, some gene flow between them that are going to link the populations, keep them healthy, keep them from inbreeding. And if that first pool does have many years in a row where it doesn't produce any frogs, that population might temporarily go extinct and might be recolonized by the other pool. So having connectivity between pools is very important for the long run. And the more that we have urbanization and more sprawl development, which is a huge factor in southern Maine and in southern New England, the less connected these populations are, so they're less likely to recover. So right now we're looking okay in Maine, but it's not the peachiest of outlook for frogs in general. There was recently a study by USGS, I want to say it came out in the past 5 years, where they found that frogs in general, every species of frog all over the United States, is declining by a rate of 3% per year. So if we expand that 3% this year, then 3% the next year, it's like interest, where it's going to be, the decline is going to be growing swifter and swifter. And if we don't do something about this, our great-grandchildren might not have frogs anymore. So Froggy Doomday, sorry for the downer. Go out and vote and stop using lawn chemicals. Keep your cats inside.
There you go. So another question is from Sue Richardson. She says, great info, thanks. Do the viruses you mentioned also affect peepers? And if a vernal pool that has had lots of frog sounds for years suddenly goes quiet, is the virus the most likely cause?
The virus usually affects the tadpoles metamorphing. The adults can be carriers of the virus and they can be infected by the virus, but it usually doesn't hurt them that badly. So that the way that the virus survives from years to years is by infecting adults. The adults don't actually get sick, they just carry the virus, and then when they go back to the pool, they reintroduce it into the pool and infect their offspring pretty much. So that they act as carriers. So in that situation, we would expect that the tadpoles would be more affected, and maybe over years and years of repetitive die-offs, we would see a decline in the adult peepers and silence in the pool itself. But I don't think that's what's going on here. I have heard from people all over the state this year who have always had peepers calling from their vernal pool or their permanent pond, and then this year it's been quiet. So I think there's some other thing going on. There's some other culprit here that's causing a decline in peepers in certain areas, and this would be a great thing to study. If there's any future grad students out there listening that need a project, mapping these occurrences and trying to figure out what's going on with these sudden declines, because I've heard it both for peepers and for American toads, that people have always had American toads and suddenly they're gone. It might be the virus, but I think there's something else going on here.
So I have a question for you. Are there studies that are going on with amphibians in Maine that our volunteer observers might be able to volunteer to be participants in?
Oh yeah. So right now we have a study going on in northern Maine and in down east areas where there's my colleague, my office mate, Scott Lindenman, is accepting volunteers to go out and look for different species of amphibians and reptiles. They're focusing on the Maine Amphibian and Reptile Atlas. So this is an atlas that shows where the different species are, the geographic range within the state. And it's based on quadrants where they'll go out to different counties and someone will find the animal and report it. And then we know where the animals occur. And this is becoming increasingly important with, of course, climate change, because if the ranges of these animals shift, if they start moving further north or they start declining, we want to have data to be able to compare the future to now. So Scott is taking volunteers. They generally camp, but he does take people for the day. And you might volunteer for a day and he might put you in a boat and tell you to paddle around and look for water snakes and snapping turtles, or you might be walking along a dirt road at night listening for great tree frogs calling. You can find his not his contact information, but if you go to the Of Pools and People webpage, www.vernalpools.me, there's a contact button, and if you hit that, you can write a little blurb in there saying you're interested in volunteering for him, and that'll get forwarded to him so that he can then contact you. He is particularly looking for people this summer. He has, I think he's got a crew of about 4 people going out right now.
Mhm.
And the next 2 weeks, they're off. After that, they'll be back to looking for animals in the down east and the northern areas in Maine. There's also a few studies going out of colleges in the southern part of Maine in York County. So if you would like to get involved in an amphibian study, you can Google your local college and find the biology department, send them an email and ask if there's anybody who's accepting volunteers.
Great. Well, that's great. Well, this has been really wonderful, Chris, and I can't thank you enough. And with that, we'll thank everyone for participating, and this will be up on our website as a recording, and you can share it with your friends and neighbors and other volunteers. So again, thank you so much, Chris. It's been very, very wonderful presentation and information.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.